Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Pride Edition version of the Student Voice podcast. My name is Evan. I'm one of your ambassadors, and I'm here with my wonderful ambassador team. Hi, Karimah. How are you?
I'm good, Evan.
Wonderful to see you. And lovely Chloe. Always good to see you, Chloe.
Hi, how are you?
And Jin. How are you, Jin? Good to see you.
Yeah, well, Evan, how are you?
Jin, every time I see that green screen, I've said it before, right? I expect to see some sort of thing happening in the background, like some sort of, maybe you can inspire us during the podcast. You might want to change your screen. It could even be part of the competition that we run, maybe. Jin's functioning screen in the background. We're also here with a very special guest. So our guest today is Nita Mannering. Nita is a relationship manager with Pride in Diversity. Welcome, Nita.
Hi, thanks for having me, everyone.
It's our pleasure. So, Nita, let's just start off with maybe telling us a little bit about what you do in Pride and Diversity and maybe also what Pride and Diversity is.
Yeah, sure. So Pride and Diversity is a division of ACON, which is a health organisation in New South Wales. What we do is LGBTQ workplace inclusion training for members. So our members are corporations or universities. Any sort of organisation can approach us and access our services. We come into the workplace and help educate the team on how to be more LGBTQ inclusive in general. And then we also have more targeted training around trans and gender diverse and how to be an active ally. So there's a few different trainings that we offer. And we do also run the Australian Workplace Equality Index, which is like a benchmark sort of grading system so that organisations can see how well they fare against other employers around Australia.
Great. Nita, we hear the term inclusive a lot nowadays, right? Can you give us an idea about what it means to be inclusive and how perhaps we can be more inclusive in our personal lives?
Yeah, for sure. So if I had my slide deck, I'd have a little table, a triangle that shows basically the three levels of inclusion. So at the bottom, you'd have tolerance, which is where you can see that there are LGBTQ people around you, people that identify. You're aware that people identify as LGBTQ, but you don't want to be near it. You just accept that it's there. So tolerance is kind of the base level. We then have acceptance and above that inclusion. So acceptance and inclusion do sound similar and definitely a lot better than tolerance. But the difference between accepting LGBTQ people and being inclusive is that inclusion is a really active term. So to be inclusive, you're going to need to take some action and show some visible signs of support and go a little bit out of your way just to help bring that marginalized community up in line with everyone else.
Great. Karimah, do you have any questions for Nita?
Yeah, so I'm actually from Malaysia, Nita, and the LGBTQ community isn't really as free to be, vocalized as compared to here in Australia. So for me, it is a big difference, and even myself, I'm not even that aware, I feel, in terms of, LGBTQ knowledge. And sometimes, I don't want to come across as disrespectful or say the wrong thing, but sometimes I'm just not sure. So for example, just the term like LGBTQ, is it LGBT, LGBTQ, LGBTQIA plus? Is there like a preference which the community prefers we use? Because I'm personally not entirely sure.
Yeah, sure. Look, Karimah, all of the acronyms that you listed are completely acceptable. There's no sort of universally agreed acronym. We at ACON and Pride and Diversity, we use LGBTQ only because after discussing with the intersex community, they would prefer to do their own workplace training. They have what's called the Darlington Statement, which is nothing about us without us. So we've basically said, like, we completely acknowledge that you're a part of the community, but we're not the experts. That's why we don't use the one of like the longer acronyms that you mentioned. But like they're all correct, and there's some that are even longer that include, sister girl and brother boy and other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander terms. In other countries, in America, there are terms SS, which is twin spirit, which is a term that Native Americans use. So around the world, you find it varies, and all are correct. So don't be shy, just find one that rolls off the tongue and
Okay,
you'll
cool.
be
That's
fine.
good to know.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Nita, we hear about being an ally,
Mhm.
right? So I know that people talk about, I'm an ally, they're an ally. Can you explain to us what it means to be an ally and what we can do to become one?
Yeah, for sure. So being an ally just means that while you don't belong to a particular community, you support them and you accept them, and hopefully, even better, you include them. So with allies, as I sort of mentioned earlier, with the acceptance versus inclusive attitude, you can be an active ally or you can be more of a passive ally. And the thing is, passive allies are great and, we love them dearly, but often we're not actually aware that they are an ally. So from here on, when I'm talking about being an ally, just assume I'm talking about being active, okay? Because they're the ones that we're really trying to bring up in the community. Like for example, a really great example of active allyship here in Australia was the sort of semi-recent marriage plebiscite, where Australia got together and debated whether we should change the law around marriage to recognise same-sex unions. And look, LGBTQ people are only about 10, 11% of the population. We were never going to get this over the line by ourselves. But, we went out to the wider community. All the allies around Australia were called to action and asked to, go out of their way to go and, have debates with family members, to participate in news polls and that sort of thing, stopped on the streets by reporters, and then eventually to vote in the plebiscite. So that vote was voluntary, but 80% of Australia showed up to vote for it. So that's pretty impressive. And then out of those numbers, over 60% voted yes. So that's sort of an example of being an active ally, where you recognize that in this case, the LGBTQ community, they're starting with a bit of, imagine like a running race. We're starting behind the starting line. We're handicapped 50 meters. So our allies, our active allies, help bring us up to start from the same starting line. In terms of being an active ally, a few points to cover there. What we've got here, like in this virtual world, visible signs of inclusion. So whether it's a lanyard or a pin on your lapel, perhaps you have a background like Jin. I'm looking, you could do some really impressive stuff with that green screen.
Come on, Jin.
There better be something going on when this comes to editing. Or even as we can see here with having pronouns in your in your email signatures or in meetings. They're all very simple ways that you can just show, hey, I am inclusive of LGBTQ people. And it just makes people feel safer, and just creates a space where if people in the community want to talk about their sexuality or their gender diversity, they know that you're someone that they can be safe to do that around.
So I guess, Nita, would you say that there's kind of a spectrum in terms of how active you can be? So let's say we're doing baby steps, someone's quite new to all this, they start with using inclusive language and then slowly work their way. But will still us using inclusive language be an example of us being active?
Yeah, absolutely. Being respectful of people's pronouns, using pronouns. If you accidentally use the incorrect pronoun for someone, you're acknowledging it and moving on with the conversation, correcting others if you hear them use the incorrect pronoun for someone. I can sort of give you some guidance on how to do that. I know it can be a little bit tricky, but speaking for members of the community when we're not there to stand up for ourselves, even in those tiny ways, is a really great way. We don't expect everyone to pick up a placard and storm the Capitol sort of thing. It's not like that. There are really easy ways that you can show your inclusivity in the workplace for sure.
So you
Yeah,
don't
awesome.
you don't have to be in the community to be an active ally. You can be
No, and that's really the point, right? So I'm bisexual, and I would say that I'm an ally to the trans and lesbian and gay and intersex people of the community. I don't think anyone could speak to all the letters, right? So, but I would say I'm an ally to the rest of the community. And, people who identify as cisgender heterosexual, they would definitely be allies as well. Allyship is not sort of exclusively for anyone. Anyone can be an ally.
That's amazing. I didn't know about that. Yeah.
So taking into account our context as a university, we've got student representative councils who are kind of there to be the voice for students, and of course there are LGBTQ students in Torrens University. So what are some of the activities we could do as students within our universities? Like, would this podcast, for example, be an act of inclusion or advocacy, would you say?
Yeah, I would say so for sure. I'm not sure if we'll be discussing your Pride Network here today, but I know that developing a Pride Network is something that the university was working on. So just giving that project airtime is great. I can see that some people here are already displaying pronouns. Perhaps this is going to spark some ideas for people listening or watching. That's something easy I can do. I can chuck a pronoun on my Teams. That's an easy one and done job just to show that I am an ally. And the same with the backgrounds, right? So I imagine a lot of what you do is virtual. And I'm not sure if the university has a sort of a branded background, but there's a million and one images on the online that you could find to set up your background. You don't necessarily need a green screen, although I'm sure yours would be way more impressive, Jim. I think also when you have student events, I know that there was some questions coming up around events in particular, just acknowledging that for some students who are trans or gender diverse, that the name that they're enrolled under may not be the name that they actually identify as. And if possible, if you know of individuals who are trans and gender diverse, having a conversation with them beforehand. Hey, what name would you like us to print on your badge, for example? It can be a really uncomfortable situation to arrive and have your dead name or a name that you no longer align with because it's what's on your enrollment. So that's one way to be inclusive as well, specifically around events. And I guess just being conscious of not using gendered language. So, and this is the hardest one for me. I almost need like an electric shock collar, but not using terms like, hey guys, or whatever you guys want, or things like that. I'm
Yeah,
so
I think
bad
I'm
for it.
guilty of that too.
Yeah, because I've been in training where it wasn't even like you're addressing the room. It was further down the track. My colleague had said, oh, take as long as you want, guys. And someone put in the chat, please don't use the term guys. I'm not a guy. So, there's a lot of gendered language that we don't use intentionally gendered, like whatever, bro. Like bro is gendered. So's dude or chicks or ladies and gentlemen, super gendered. So in the event space, I'll just be conscious of using more inclusive terms, just like, hey, beautiful people, hey, everyone, hey, peeps, just those tiny little tweaks can make a real difference.
How do we? I know it's difficult sometimes. I mean, Karimah said that she's guilty of saying "Hey guys," and Nita, you said the same thing, and look, I do as well. And now that you've said that, I hadn't even thought about that,
Yeah.
right? Because I start a lot of my emails with "Hey guys," right? I very rarely say, "Oh, hey," sometimes "Hey, beautiful people." How can we start to get ourselves into the habit of, like, how can we make the change ourselves? Obviously, to be an ally, we want to show our support, right? So, I mean, in your situation, so you obviously have the same problem. You said, what do you do to try and stop yourself really from, no, I've got to be more conscious of this?
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm very I've come from a corporate background, so I used to work for an insurance company, and I was kind of breaking the norm by going into this more gender neutral space. And so that made it harder because everyone else is using colloquial, casual language and gendered words that we've just mentioned, and I was trying not to. But now that I work for Pride and Diversity, it's like if you start a meeting with "Hey guys," you'll almost get something thrown at you across the room. So I'm very privileged in that way. I would say
Yeah.
from the environments that you work in, something that I have found useful is my email signature actually has a greeting already built into it, so that when I go to type in an email, it'll automatically say like, "Hey everyone," or like, "Hey people," or whatever. It's
Yeah.
so then so as soon as I open up a new email, I'm like, "That's right." It's because it turns out
Yeah.
it's not practical to actually wear a shot collar in the office. Um, so that would be one way. Having like, it sounds so simplistic, but like a sticker on your laptop, like maybe next to the mouse pad or something. Um, and also one sign of inclusivity, sorry, I forgot to mention before, that can be really helpful in a study space is if you do attend in-person lessons, having like stickers on your Surface Pros or the back of your laptop that face out into the room. So, you don't see it, but everyone else in the room sees it. That's another really accessible but powerful way to show that you're an ally in a room of people who wouldn't, know otherwise.
Okay.
And
Nita.
I think, sorry,
Oh,
Evan,
sorry,
just
Karimah.
like
No,
on
Karimah, you're
the
right.
Hmm.
inclusive language, it's just practice, isn't it? Right? Like the
Yeah.
more you do it, the more it gets drilled into your head. And I guess, like you said, if you've got an environment where people will call you out or they'll remind you, and it's not being aggressive, it's just like,
Totally.
hey, by the way, in case you forgot, da 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 da, and
Hmm.
you just get reminded. And I think that's good having other people within your environment to kind of just give you those gentle reminders, because you can't always remember, right? Like you said, you're breaking out from a
Hmm.
bad habit, which is really difficult to do than just learning a new habit from scratch.
Yeah.
So,
And I think it's important to remember that, we're trying to rewire our brains after a lifetime of gendered language.
mm,
So I remember being so anxious my first couple of weeks. I was terrified I was going to misgender one of my gender diverse colleagues. And, another colleague reminded me, like, Nita, you've been around for 30 years using he and she. It's not going to happen overnight that you adjust to using they, them where appropriate. You will make mistakes, and it's just about doing the best you can. You will get better at it, 100%. And it really does catch on like wildfire. Like, once it does sound a bit strange when you start, using new terminology, but if enough people do it, it becomes the norm very quickly.
Yeah. Nita, speaking about pronouns, let's ask this question. So I know that a lot of
Mm,
students certainly come up to me and they don't understand why we should use pronouns and
mm,
even maybe what the pronouns mean. And I know that
sure.
you've said before, certainly about using gender inclusive language, that and Karimah also mentioned that we do slip up and we are going to make mistakes.
Hmm.
What can we do? So I guess a three-pronged question.
Hmm.
What can we do if we do slip up, right? If we do assume someone's
Yeah.
pronoun and we get into a situation where they might feel uncomfortable, they might say something, or they just, get angry. How can we sort of, come back from that? What can we do to improve that situation?
Yeah, yeah, for sure. So I think that by displaying your pronouns, if virtual, or introducing yourself with your pronouns, if it's sort of a face-to-face conversation with someone for the first time, is the best way to preempt misgendering someone. So if I met, if I was in front of a room of people and said, "Oh, hi everyone, my name's Nita Mannering, my pronouns are she, her," usually from that point on, people will introduce me, they'll mirror back that introduction. So that's really helpful. If you do get it wrong or you make an assumption that's incorrect and the person is a little bit, maybe a bit short with you or a bit angry or upset, don't feel like the worst person in the world. Chances are that person's been misgendered 100 times that week, and this is just the straw that's broke the camel's back, or they may have read some, horrible media about the trans and gender diverse community 5 minutes before and then being misgendered, so it's really triggering. Just moral of the story is don't take it personally, and also don't make a big deal about it, because it really just makes it worse, right? You just be, I'm so sorry, they, you know, it and the funny thing about pronouns is you never use a pronoun to someone's face. It's only when you're talking to others about that person. Because of course, if I was
Of
talking to you,
course.
Evan, I'm just gonna say Evan or you. I'm not gonna be using anything. So it's really only, in these more conversational or group settings that it can occur. So I don't think there's danger on every corner. It's only certain circumstances that this is even going to be relevant. But yeah, I think it's just remembering that the reason we use pronouns they them is to recognize gender and gender diverse and trans people, and say we respect your experience and we accept you for who you are.
I think that's very important, because I know that we had an event here on campus late last year, and a student came up to me and said, but that's a woman, so why do I have to call them they? I don't understand that, right?
Yeah.
And having that conversation as student leaders can be sometimes difficult, right? Because a lot of students don't understand, right? They just come from that sort of cultural background where they just don't understand. And it can be sometimes a very difficult conversation to have, because even if you do explain why, they still just can't understand. So, certainly as a predominantly, and we had this conversation yesterday, as a predominantly international student university, where we have students from various cultural backgrounds, and there are a lot of students who just don't understand pronouns at all. So,
Yeah.
having that pronoun conversation can be very difficult, but also for them, seeing someone as, physically, might look like a woman or a man, but then they choose the pronoun they instead of him or her. Is a very difficult conversation for us to have. So do you have any tips on how we can maybe navigate some of those difficult conversations and explain to a student, well, this is why that person has chosen that pronoun?
Yeah, for sure. I think it's important, first of all, just to point out to someone struggling with the concept, is that it's highly unlikely that you actually know 100% for sure what gender that person was assigned at birth. Like that you're already making an assumption based on their outward appearance before you even get started. So sort of that's one element of it. The other thing, like the next thing would be that, under the Discrimination Act, trans and gender diverse people are protected by law. So the reason why you need to be respectful of them is actually enshrined in Australian law. They have the right to feel safe at work, and to deliberately misgender someone is actually a form of harassment and bullying. So um, it's not like something that the university's made up to make your life difficult. This is a part of Australian culture and law. So there's kind of a serious element to it there. And I think also, which is a more sort of difficult concept to explain at an event, but maybe something that could be covered in an online module or a more formal training session, would be that, we have the heteronormative binary of male and female, and that story does work for most of the population. You're assigned male at birth, you appear masculine, you identify as a male, and you fall in love with women because you're straight. And that narrative works for, born as a woman, I identify as female, I look feminine, dress long hair, and I'm attracted to men. So that's what we call the heteronormative binary, and that formula works for 89% of the population, right? So it is the majority, but there are 11% of people that are all shades of grey in between those two. And that we just need to be respectful that everyone's experience is different, and that includes people with a trans experience.
I think as well, Evan, with that student who approached you, I know it's a difficult conversation to have, but I think the fact that you did try to explain means a lot, because you are standing up for those people in the community, who probably unaware that this person doesn't understand, or wants to use incorrect pronouns or the incorrect language. So the fact that you are standing up for him, standing up for the
Yeah.
community against
Mm.
him and challenging that, I think is really good. It's
And it
a
sounds like it's
starting point.
definitely, sorry to interrupt you,
No,
Karima,
no, go ahead, Nita.
but I think, in a lot of these instances, it is about education.
Yeah, definitely.
In the Australian education system and then in the workplace, we do have a lot of resources at our disposal, and there's even programs in schools. We have a Safe Schools program and Minus 18 in organisations like this, Wear It Purple Day, to shine light on these diversity issues. And I understand that for a lot of your student cohort, that's just not the case. So we definitely we aim to educate, not to point blame or ostracize people.
I was actually going to comment on that. If there's, for someone, for those who might, because I know you mentioned at the start, there are sort of different groups in terms of those who are inclusive, those who just accept, then tolerant. But I guess there's also those who are intolerant as
Mm-hmm.
well. So
Yeah.
I guess they're probably people that aren't going to come across in terms of being to tolerate others or accepting each other. Is there sort of any resources or anything that you can recommend to us because I'm sure that there would be those in our student community who might be intolerant. How do we deal with? It's not. I guess how do we deal with those students? How do we sort of bring them into that conversation in terms of trying to help them understand the differences so they become more inclusive?
Good
Yeah.
question.
Yeah, look, it's really challenging. And I think when we talk about inclusivity, one thing I forgot to mention is that inclusivity is not about changing people's beliefs. All we're talking about is how you act and how you behave. So to live, work, and study in Australia, you are expected to be, at the very minimum, tolerant and respectful of everyone, regardless of their gender, their sexuality, their religious beliefs, their cultural backgrounds, people who have disabilities. We First Nations people, like, you can go on and on and on. The inclusion is not just about LGBTQ people. It's about anyone who doesn't basically who isn't normal, whatever normal means. So I think it can be helpful to remind people who are intolerant of LGBTQ people that in Australia they might actually be in a minority group themselves, and how would they feel if they were treated by their peers or by their colleagues in such a dismissive or rude and bullying way. I understand that can be a little bit more of a confrontational conversation, so you'd be in the right context, but inclusivity is for everyone. We certainly don't put LGBTQ inclusivity above any other group. And in terms of resources, I can only speak for within Australia. But there's lots of webs, like for example, Trans Hub is a great community-run website which explains a lot about what is a trans experience, why do we use pronouns, what do they mean. It has great examples. So that could be a website that is beneficial to people struggling. But I suppose in terms of LGBTQ, like sort of awareness and education, that at a more fundamental level, I feel like the university probably would have some resources around that, or there's plenty of websites, like the ACON website, the Pride and Diversity website that we run. If a student wanted to be educated, just even to understand terminology and things like that, you could look it up on YouTube. Like there's a plethora of resources out there. It just depends on where they are in their journey, and if they're willing to learn, and if they're not willing to learn, totally intolerant, I think it's more explaining, you just have to be respectful.
Yeah,
I think
it's
as
really
well.
refreshing. Sorry,
Sorry.
Karima, go. No.
I think as well, being able to interact with someone from the community really helps as well. They can
Yeah.
share, you know, a lot of information which they know that maybe other people don't necessarily know, right? Like, for example, their rights, the challenges they face, even how we can contribute to a more inclusive environment, because maybe we don't know, but when we have someone tell us, this is what we want, this is going to really help us, it makes it a lot easier to help them and support them, rather than just saying we need to be more inclusive, because I think that's really vague, right? But if it's coming from the community and they're really listing how we can be inclusive and how we can support that community, I think that would be really useful as well.
And the thing is, in Australia, it's hard enough to come out or to be completely open about your sexuality. In other countries, it's illegal. And in other countries, it's not illegal, but it's culturally quite taboo. And I can only imagine the barriers that LGBTQ people face overseas. We're very lucky here. So to circle back to why these little why the little rainbows and why the pronouns and stuff are so impactful is because it is sending universal kind of message that you're safe with me, and it might create a space for a peer or a colleague to be more themselves around you, and just be able to bring their full self to work or to their studies. um, Yes, I just think it's about creating a safe space. You don't know by looking at someone if they're LGBTQ. Um,
And it's interesting you mentioned that as well, Nita, because I have a friend who I've known for a really long time, and he identifies himself as gay, and he's literally living with his partner and everything.
mhm,
But till this day, he's already in his 30s, he still hasn't told his parents
mhm.
that he's gay, which I find very sad, because that
Yeah,
is who you are, that is your identity. So to hide something like that to your parents is quite a big deal, and it's really sad, I feel.
yeah.
It is sad, and it's difficult, right? So, I mean, I came out in the 1800s, right, a long time ago, and it was very difficult when I came out in 1991, right? So there was listening to this conversation is wonderful, because I hear all these amazing things that are being done in this space, and these conversations that we're having that we weren't having 30 years ago.
Mm,
When I came out, and there were no resources, right? There was an AIDS Council of South Australia, which was manned by
mhm,
2 volunteers who worked 3 hours a day. And there was a gay newspaper that came out once a month that was 4 pages long, and that was it. And you got all your resources from that.
mm,
So I'm lucky that I went to Adelaide University, which was very liberal back in those days. It still is. And you learn a lot from meeting up with people and chatting and having those conversations. But I'm one of the very fortunate people. So I come from a very conservative Greek background, but I bit the bullet and I came out when I was 17 and told my parents, and hid in case I got yelled at. But I was very lucky. I was very fortunate that both my parents were very accepting and very loving, and they've been very supportive ever since. But Karimah, your friend's situation is not unique, as well. Like, I
mm,
don't mean to take away from it, but so many people. I've got friends who are
Yeah.
my age, right, in their late, who are living with their partners and been openly gay to each other and to me since we went to high school together. So 30 years, and only their partner knows they're gay. That's it. And a couple of their
mm.
friendship groups. Like, they can't tell their employer, they can't tell their family. And their family still puts pressure on them to get married, and to do
Yeah.
all these things. So it's really difficult. But I think having these conversations is really good, right? So talking about inclusion and actually being an ally and helping people in the community is really going to help, break some of those stigmas, and squash some of those barriers. Because I think, like you, Karima, I couldn't imagine not being out to people. It would be horrible. So,
Yeah, and I think it takes a lot of courage as well. So if you're
yeah,
in an environment where everyone is welcoming, no matter what you identify
yeah,
as, it makes it a lot easier. There's
Mhm.
not as much pressure because you feel you've got that support around you.
And I think
yeah,
it's
definitely.
important to recognize that, don't ever assume that someone needs to come out either. So sort
Yeah,
of
that's very true.
the flip side is someone's sexual identity, and sexual orientation is personal and it's unique, and don't ever speak for someone else. So all we're trying to do with inclusivity is create a space where, whether you're straight, LGBTQIA+, no matter what you are, if you want to talk about it, you can. But I would just say be careful not to accidentally out someone. Like if someone comes out to you, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're ready for the wider community to know. So always treat that information as privileged and keep it private. And also, we're talking about assumptions before, sort of don't assume that someone needs to come out. I recently was attending some training and someone said, oh, I know it's an inclusive workplace because I'm straight as an arrow, but, a bit on the skinny side and everyone thought I was gay, and kept on kind of, dropping hints and trying to sort of suggest that he needed to come out. And he's like, I don't, but like, thank you. But, just being, I suppose, open, but not expecting or forceful.
Yeah, definitely. Guys, are there any final questions before we wrap up? No? Nita, thank you very, very much for coming along today.
Yeah,
We're really happy that we've had this conversation with you, and we will, as leaders and ambassadors, take this conversation to our fellow students and to our fellow campuses across the country, and really start to promote inclusivity and also start to develop our Pride Network, which is something that I've been working on in the background for the last few months at university, and really start to we really want to have some Pride clubs on campus, on our campuses. Share that love with everyone. So thank you so much for coming today. Thank you, Karimah, of course, as always. Thank you, Chloe. Thank you, Jin. And stay tuned for our next Student Voice podcast. There'll be some questions coming up in our newsletter about this podcast. So we hope you've listened very carefully and very attentively, and there'll be some lovely prizes to be won as well. So thank you very much, everyone, for your time. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.